at the end of Hebrews chapter 12, we'll read the last two verses. That's verses 28 and 29. So you've risen for the reading of the Word. And the author here writes the following at the very end of the chapter, beginning in verse 28. It says, "Wherefore we, receiving a kingdom which cannot be moved, let us have grace whereby we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear. For our God is a consuming fire." You may be seated. Today, as I left the house this morning and began to go out and work in the yard, began to start a fire. As I was putting everything together and catching the limbs on fire and started watching it, I began to dwell on this verse in Scriptures about our God as a consuming fire. And there's things that can be learned just from what you see, what you do, what you put your hands on and your eyes on, where the Scriptures show you truth, and then the Lord will put it right in front of you. Now, I've got looking at this, and I want to preach about consumed by fire. Now, there's some things I don't really have to tell you, but I'll tell you again anyhow. We know that fire in the Bible often reflects God. It reflects His judgment. At times it reflects His light. It reflects a lot about the characteristics of God. But in this it says is a consuming fire. And so this especially speaks to God's judgment and His thorough erasure of sin. In other words, He erases sin, does away with it, must destroy sin. Now also, if God's a consuming fire, something has to get consumed. And what I want to deal with is, again, I was looking at wood on the fire. I've told you before often that just as trees are people, wood often in the Bible represents your flesh. And in the giving of the sacrifices at the altar, fresh wood had to be put on daily and the ashes hauled away. And that again represents how our flesh, us, we die daily. Paul said, I die daily. And we see that in the wood that's put on the fire. And the wood is consumed by fire. And that's what I want to preach about, being consumed by fire. This is where you and I are every day. It's where we're at in all of our Christian walk. It's what is part of our life from the day that we're saved until the day that we die, is being consumed by fire. That is to say, our flesh being consumed by God. Now, the first thing that I noticed while I was watching the fire is how that new wood, fresh wood, when you put it on, the first state that it goes through is resistance. First thing it does is resist. Have you ever tried to start a fire and not had enough kindling? The big wood resists it, doesn't it? Can you take a match and light up a log? Oh no, that log will resist being consumed. It doesn't just poof, catch on fire. It has to have enough heat for enough time. It resists being burned. And your flesh resists being consumed by God. Does it not? I mean, if you have a bad habit, for example, if you have something about you that's been part of you for all these years and it's grown and grown and got larger and larger, doesn't it resist being consumed by God? You see, so the first stage is resistance. And I was watching and looked, and even though, you know, that wood's dead, it's been cut off, it's dead. The wood that I had out there burning had been there for 3 weeks. And so it's dead enough to burn, and it is. But as I watched it, as it gets hot, as it gets hotter and hotter, as it's resisting the burning, you begin to see the sap and the water begin to bubble out on the ends of it. And what that is, the sap and the water, is the life of that thing. Now, I said it was dead, but it still had something of the old life to it. And even though when we're saved, we die. We die to ourselves. We're born in Christ. Our flesh still has something of the old life to it. And that's why that you struggle with the things that enter into your mind, that want to go out of your mouth. And I hope you're able to control them, but I understand it's a battle. And I'm not just speaking of cuss words. I'm talking bad about people. I'm talking about every kind of thing that would go out of our mouth. This is the old flesh. And even though it's dead, it's still got something of its old life to it. And it resists being consumed by the fire. And so this is part of our battle every day. Now at this stage when the fire is going to consume the wood, but it's resisting, it looks ugly. The wood gets blackened. It looks ugly to the outside, and it's an ugly fight. When we have things about us that need to be consumed by God, but they're not. They're resistant. They want to pop up every day. They want to cry out and say, I'm part of your life. I remember when I first got saved and I began to struggle against some of my old habits, and I wanted to put down my cigarettes, and I wanted to for a long time actually, but in my mind it would keep fighting against me and say, well, look over there at so-and-so or brother so-and-so, they're saved and they smoke. And look at so-and-so that you knew way back in your childhood, and they were saved and they smoke, and you don't have to quit. That's not in the Bible. But I knew I wanted to put her down, and it resisted me. And so it is with everything about us that we want to be consumed by God, whether we have a problem with gossip, whether we have a problem with envy, whatever it might be. If we have a problem with it, and we know it needs to be consumed in that fire, it will resist. And in your mind, you'll fight these battles, and something will say, well, you don't have to get rid of that. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. Well, what about brother or sister so-and-so? And so you'll have this, and it's ugly. It's ugly. And at first, it seems like the only thing being consumed is the outside, but the inside's still there, and it's still strong, and it is. It is. If you ever pulled a log out of the fire, when all that had happened is it just charred the outside, that log is still strong. And your flesh, even though it's been exposed to the consuming fire of God, even though the Holy Ghost has convicted you of problems in your flesh, and you put them before God, and you prayed to Him, and you've asked for His help, in the early stages of that thing, the flesh is still strong, though it be dead. And it has to stay in that fire. And it's important that it stay in that fire. If that flesh comes out of the fire, it'll remain strong. It has to stay in the fire. And if there's any victory at all, we have to stay in the battle. We have to put these things before God. We have to constantly go and say, God, I've got a problem. I've still got this problem, and I failed you again, and I need your help. And it seems like it's just desperate sometimes. Seems like we're praying and can't get an answer sometimes. I know I'm speaking from my own experience, but I believe you're made out of the same flesh I am. And it seems like we can't get any help. Understand it's a process. It's a process. Logs don't catch on fire and poof, gone. They have to go through the fire continually. Continually. The heat builds up. It gets hot. It gets miserable. They roast. But eventually, that old semblance of life, that old water that's in there will get gone. The water vapor will get gone. And the sap will bubble out. And eventually that thing will be dry and it'll start burning. That's when we get to the next stage. Next stage. At first, your flesh will resist. That stage of resistance. But after a while, you'll begin to get some victory over your own flesh. And you'll get to a point of, I don't know if you want to call it resolution or resignation. You'll get to the point where your flesh begins to yield up to God. There comes a point in time where wood in a fire begins to yield to the fire. It may even bust open. It may not, but it'll yield up. It'll start to charcoal. It'll start to burn hot. And there comes a time, if we can stay with it, if we can keep at it, where the very things which once were so hard for us to deal with will begin to catch fire and be consumed, and they'll have less strength and less power as every day goes by. You know, I don't have a hard time anymore like I did. I'm not saying that my flesh isn't my flesh, but on some of those early habits that I wondered if I'd ever have any victory, I don't have that hard time anymore that I once had. And it's not all that hard for me anymore to not cuss. You know, because that's something that's been consumed in the fire pretty good now. I'm not saying that nothing ever pops up in my mind. It does. It does. But there's been long enough now. There's been enough years. Even that's less and less and less. And coming out of my mouth is something it's not hard for me to resist now like it once was. You see, because that log's been in the fire a long time. And it's been in the fire a long time, and it's passed resistance. And it's resigned itself to God. And it opens itself up to God. And you know, there's more than one log in a fire. There's several things about your flesh that need to be given to God, that need to be given over to that consuming fire, which is our God. There's a lot of things about us that do. If I name all the sins that are in the Bible, you're guilty of a whole lot more than one or two. And so am I. And I'm not just talking about things we have done. I'm talking about our very nature has problems, and more than one. And we have problems with greed, and we have problems with envy, and we have problems with lust, and we have problems with hatred, and we have problems. And these things have to be resigned to the fire. But as they are, as these things catch fire and begin to burn, something really interesting starts to happen. The fire begins to build on itself, and that log at one time was such a problem because it didn't want to catch fire. Now it becomes a great help because it's burning with such an intense fire, it wants to catch other things on fire. And so while at first we have such a hard time getting any victory at all in our life, and we count small victories for great victories. After all, when you first start a fire, don't you count it a pretty good victory just to get the twigs burning, just to get the little kindling wood burning. But as it goes, we catch bigger and bigger wood burning. And so it is in our Christian life, that at first all we can do is get a little victory here and a little victory there. But as we go, it begins to burn on itself. And so you get bigger victories and bigger victories because the fire that's burning builds on itself, and the things that once were problems for us now become blessings for us because we look back, we see what God's done, and it burns the fire hotter on the remaining problems we have. And our flesh that's dead and subjected to the fire of the Holy Ghost of God begins to burn more and be consumed more and more. If only we stay in the fire.
Amen.
The victory builds on itself. Problems we have, we get more victory over, and more and not less. Because these things reserve, these things that are resigned to God, these things that give themselves over to the fire, at that point they burn hotter and hotter and hotter. That's where we need to be. And that fire that burns so hot and burns out. It's pictured several times in the Scriptures. Pictured by the coals on the altar. Pictured by the burning bush. It talks about the power of the fire. The power of God, who is that consuming fire. Consuming us in our flesh. I said you'll fight this to the day you die. And you will. But there comes a time when there's a complete victory by the fire. Not by the wood, by the fire. At a certain point, the fire consumes everything that's there. And there comes a day when our flesh is completely destroyed. That's right. Now, I don't believe it's completely destroyed to the day you die. But thank God, don't you thank God that you don't have to go off into eternity in this flesh? It wouldn't be heaven if you had to deal with this flesh. It wouldn't be heaven if you had to. I'm not just talking about the aching knees and bad backs. I'm talking about the thoughts of the mind, the temptations. It wouldn't be heaven if you had to deal with that. But thank God, the fire gets complete victory. Thank God there comes a time, and before it's burned every coal into dust, along the way, there comes times where parts of that flesh that were once big hunks of wood have burned down and coaled up to the point that you can see what they were, but they're not what they were. Where once they had strong resistance, they've been burned so much. Have you ever seen it? where they burn into a white coal, and if you touch it with another stick, it'll just fall apart into dust. The victory of the fire is going to happen. It's going to happen. It's the natural course of things. If the wood stays in the fire. If you have problems, you ain't the only one. That's our natural state. But it's also in our natural state, if we're a child of God, to have victory over problems. It is our natural course, if we're children of God and obedient to Him. And by obedient to Him, I mean staying in the fire. It's our natural course that over time, we should have more victory over our flesh and more victory over our flesh. And that fire should burn within us. It should consume us. Consume us to the point that we are completely given over to Him. Oh, I know you got resistant little hard knots along the way. I'm made out of the same stuff you are. But I just want to remind you tonight that the fire wins. The fire wins. And if you're a child of God, and if you stay with Him, and if you stay in the fire, and if you pray before God for victory over your flesh, you will have it. You will have victory over your flesh. Though you fight to the last day that you live, though there's problems to face to the last day that you live, there will be victory over your flesh. Logs don't outlast the fire. The fire consumes it. And our God is a consuming fire. And when He's got us thoroughly consumed, we'll resist Him no more. And your flesh will be given over to Him completely and be where you're supposed to be. I hope it helps you. I want it to help you. I want you to know that you do have victory in Jesus.